Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Faces of Autism. We've invited Dr. Alycia Halladay to join us this week. Dr. Halladay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for this invitation and for this opportunity to talk today. My name is Alycia Halladay. I am the Chief Science Officer at the Autism Science Foundation. I actually started in autism research, looking at the links between vaccines and autism back in the 90s, and have moved on from there to work at Autism Speaks for about 10 years. And I've been at the Autism Science Foundation for 10 years now.
Great, thank you. And let's get right into our questions for you.
Okay.
Cool. So as you've touched on earlier, tell us about your research interests and how does autism advocacy influence your work in academia?
Yeah, thank you. So I started in autism research, I should say, by looking at the links between vaccines and autism. When the theory came out in the 1990s that there was a connection, there were a couple of universities that were funded to actually look thoroughly at exposures in people's homes, and then the molecular and biological link in animal models. And so I was part of a study that went to people's homes and collected dust and air and water samples and vacuumed to look at exposures in the home. And then I was also working in animal models. Now, looking at mercury exposure in model systems and how that affected different proteins that were expressed in the brain and also different behaviors. So I worked that for a couple of years and realized I loved working within autism research, but the mercury vaccine link hypothesis had kind of, it had been studied and answered, and we were ready to move on. So it seemed like a good opportunity for me to kind of move along in my career. And I started working at Autism Speaks, where I got to work directly with families who had interests and ideas, experiences that helped shape what we fund. And that happened at Autism Speaks, and then that also carries over into the Autism Science Foundation. So at both organizations, we listened to families and to individuals to identify what their priorities were in research, what they felt needed to be explored, and then, of course, with scientists to figure out the best way to explore those ideas. While I was working at Autism Speaks, I had two daughters, and one of them was diagnosed with autism when she was 3 years old. So I'm also a parent of a daughter with autism.
Awesome. And following that, how has your experience as a parent of an autistic child impacted you?
So I feel like I kind of get it a little bit more. So I can laugh a little bit with parents when they kind of, when we commiserate, I can laugh with parents. I also get where parents are coming from when they feel like research hasn't moved fast enough, right? So I have the benefit of being a researcher before my daughter was diagnosed, and then have continued that after my daughter is diagnosed. And I've seen the kind of the evolution of what we used to think, what we used to identify as being best practices and evidence-based interventions, and what we know now. So I've been able to see kind of the evolution, but I completely get how parents are feeling like, okay, my child was diagnosed 30 years ago. Why isn't there more for me? So I completely get that.
Absolutely. Could you tell us more about your work at Autism Science Foundation?
Right. So right now at the Autism Science Foundation as the Chief Science Officer, I do a number of different things. I love it because it's different every day. Some days I'm working directly with families to help prioritize our research strategy. Other days I'm working to get those scientific ideas that we solicit from the research community reviewed so that we know which ones are the best ones to fund. Some days I'm working with researchers and scientists to kind of collaborate and build things together. So we know that one of the things is that research studies kind of can't recruit hundreds of thousands of people. They need to work together. I mean, there are some that do, but most of them need to work together to make sure that their findings generalize. So what one group found in, say, Canada is similar to what another group found in Brazil. And if that's not the case, why is the case? And so I work directly with scientists, and then also I work with patient advocacy organizations. And these are organizations that represent families with rare genetic disorders associated with autism, although I work with other family groups as well, and advocacy groups, but these are specifically those with rare genetic disorders that, we work with about, 40 of them. They all have their own priorities, right? Because their children or themselves have specific genes of interest, but they also have commonalities. And so we help solve those commonalities together. So we're not wasting our time. All 40 groups aren't wasting their time trying to study the same thing over and over again. Some things we can do as a collective. So, those are the main things I do, but things can differ every day based on, really what's going on.
Wow, that's amazing to hear. Great. And as a researcher, professor, and parent, what do you think needs to be better understood about autism?
So I think all of it, but I actually think that the number one priority right now for the autism community is understanding the spectrum, I should say. So there are individuals with autism that have severe intellectual disability. They speak no language whatsoever or have just a few words that they use. They can communicate, but it's not necessarily to the level that they want to communicate. Those people are going to require 24/7 supports throughout their life. And we've kind of given them a label called profound autism. There's also individuals with autism who can speak fluently, who may be a little bit socially awkward, who are really, really, really smart and can work independently and live independently, getting competitive jobs at places like Microsoft or Walgreens or things like that. And so they consider their autism as an identity and something that they're proud of. And there are other people that want help and support. So trying to think about all the different needs across all the different people with autism when it's such a wide spectrum is really challenging. And it's challenging for families because sometimes they don't think that other people in the community understand themselves or understand their child with autism. And it's frustrating for researchers because as they're trying to help provide more personalized supports that help the right person at the right time with the right supports, they're working with, a spectrum of autism that is really very, very diverse. And so they're really kind of suffering from this broad spectrum. So we're trying to encourage researchers and scientists to kind of think about how do we build subgroups, for lack of a better word, or labels so that scientists can better understand people with autism with commonalities rather than thinking about all the different differences that people with autism have. So I think that's really the number one thing that scientists are struggling with right now. There are other projects that there are other questions that require a lot of other kind of perspectives. So my daughter is someone who is, you would say she was low support needs, I guess, because she goes to a mainstream school with an aide. She, I have full confidence that she'll live independently. She's very clever, but she definitely has some support needs. But I don't, and she's very verbal. So I really don't doubt that at some point she's going to be able to go to college and live independently. However, I have friends that have autism that aren't like that, right? So they have intellectual disability or they have few words. And so they can live independently, maybe, or maybe not, but they will require a higher level of support needs. So, depending on their different levels of functioning, we want to make sure that this person who needs a certain level of support is getting that level of support without being assumed that that person doesn't need that amount of support. So what I've seen is that some people with high support needs aren't getting those support needs because there's an assumption that those aren't needed, that autism is just an identity. So I think that we're kind of struggling with that right now. And I understand all the different perspectives, because really kind of most people are kind of like in the middle of all this, where they do have support needs, right? So they do need either medical help or social support help or different types of therapies, or employment support. They don't necessarily see autism as an identity. They need those supports, but they can kind of live independently. So I think it's taking a really really holistic look and a really humble look, as I like to say, about all the needs of people across the spectrum.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's definitely crucial to understand that autism is a spectrum.
Yes.
Mhm. And finally, what supports do parents of autistic children have, and what kinds of supports could be improved?
So yeah, so people and families with autism have a number of supports. I do have to say that the focus has been on supporting the individual with autism, believe it or not, and not the whole family. So that's something else that Autism Science Foundation is trying to change in a mindset. We have a partnership with the L's for Autism Foundation, where we help support the needs of siblings. Um, but I think, we really need research all across the spectrum. And we really need to think about a family perspective. So some of the things I think about that really make a difference are um, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and sometimes physical therapy. You also may have medical comorbidities where you need the help of a gastroenterologist or a neurologist. Seizures and intellectual disabilities are huge problems in the autism community. And so are gastrointestinal problems. Also feeding issues. A lot of people with autism eat things like paint chips or golf balls or things like that because they like that oral sensation, or sometimes we don't really even know why. But that's the problem. So those sorts of supports tend to work. We also really need mental health supports for people with autism, right? So people with autism have a higher than expected prevalence of anxiety, OCD, ADHD, depression. And so these are things that need help. And sometimes some of the supports for those mental health needs may not be focused on autism, but we also don't know if the same things work in people with autism that work in neurotypical people. So do things like Prozac help depression in people with autism? Do things like behavioral therapies for depression and for mental health issues work in people with autism? Do the same medications work for ADHD? So some of those things we still need to test, but mental health supports and medical supports are definitely needed as well. Again, these are the sorts of things that they all need improvement. I wish I could say we need this in this area more than anything else, but as we're understanding that autism is such a spectrum, not everyone is going to need Prozac. That's okay. I'm not saying everyone should take Prozac. Not everyone is going to need ADHD medicine. Not everyone is going to need anti-seizure medication. Not everyone is going to need social supports or a social skills group, but some people do. And so we need to make sure that the precision of those things is better, that we're better matching what people need to what people get. And, unfortunately, there was a huge advocacy effort in this country to make sure that autism services were covered because they hadn't been previously covered. But I fear what's happened is that people are getting pushed into the autism label. They may not need autism services and supports. The only reason they're getting anything is because they have that autism label. And I worry sometimes that people with things like ADHD or mental health supports aren't getting those. They're getting whatever is in that autism kind of collective of interventions that is approved because of insurance advocacy in the United States. And they're not actually getting what they need because we're not taking a look at this holistically. We're not saying, okay, regardless of the autism diagnosis, what does this person need? Because they may need something different and the family may need something different, but somehow they got into this autism diagnosis and they get more prescriptive interventions based on an autism diagnosis than what they actually need. So I am concerned about that and would love to move to a system where actually people's needs are met, right, rather than their diagnosis. So yeah, so I think that's also an issue, but I'm not going to say no to insurance mandates that help people with autism either. I think we should be very thankful for those.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Halladay, for interviewing with us. The Faces of Autism team, we're so glad to have you today.
Thank you so much. And it was really a joy talking to you today, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime.
Amazing. Thank you.